All right. Well, as they were saying earlier, we're in this series called Welcome Home, and it's all about connecting, engaging people in the church, and connecting our church in the community. A home is a place where you go and you look forward to being with people, connecting. Now, it's never a perfect place. Home's never a perfect place. So we wish it was, right? We kind of ache for that. But just so you know, it's never a perfect place, so there are problems in the home. But we've been looking at a variety of qualities about the church. So the first one we looked at was in Titus, chapter 3, and it was really this, that our lives are to be a welcome mat for people who need hope. This place and us as people are to be a welcome mat for people who need hope. And I don't know if you know anybody who needs hope, but my guess is they live next door to you. My guess is they live behind you. My guess is they live just down the street from you. My guess is they maybe live in your house. Maybe that's you who needs hope. And this is supposed to be a place where it's a welcome mat for people who need hope. And then last week we talked about in Matthew 18 and Matthew 5 and in Luke chapter 12, the fact that dealing with conflict is a critically important thing, a quality for a healthy church. Dealing with conflict. Now, we wish we could say this. A church is a place where there is no conflict. So if you just come to a church, as soon as you enter the door and interact with all the people, there's no conflict. That's the way it's supposed to be. But just so you know, that's not reality. The deal is, the quality of a church is not having conflict. It's dealing with conflict and dealing with it in a healthy fashion. Because unresolved conflict festers. Unresolved conflict is like an infection. Undealt with will begin to cause a sickness and will eventually break through the surface of the skin and be an open sore and really create trouble. Unresolved conflict is an incredible destroyer of the church, of the relationships in a church, if you don't resolve it. And sometimes it means coming to agreement on something, and sometimes it means to agree to disagree in an agreeable fashion. Because it is the unity of the church that God is most interested in. It's not taking the truth and shoving it under the rug. It's bringing it out and dealing with it. That's what a church is supposed to do. It's hard. But it's what we're supposed to do. And today we want to talk in the book of James. We're going to grab a passage out of the second chapter, verses 1 through 10. And here's going to be the big idea. So if you check out and start filling out your survey, here's the big idea. You've already got it, right? Here it is. Favoritism violates the most essential core value of a gospel-centered church. Favoritism violates the most essential core value of a gospel-centered church. Now, to tell you the truth, when I kind of looked at this passage initially, I thought, I don't know if it's really all that apropos to our church. There's not really favoritism that goes on, so I just I started into the passage and I thought I'd present it. But the more I got into it, the more I thought, oh my goodness, this is really apropos for us. So, favoritism violates the most essential core value of a gospel-centered church. Now, let me just real quickly. The author of this book, the letter of James, the book of James, is a guy named James. Okay, so James wrote this thing. James, and it was written to what he calls the 12 dispersed tribes. So during the time of his ministry, the Jews had been not only dispersed earlier, like 722 BC, when they were the 10 northern tribes of Israel were dispersed all over the world. And we call them the 10 lost tribes of Israel. We've never seen them since. Never been able to identify them since 722 BC. But then, also during the time of James, the Jews were being dispersed all over the Mediterranean world. They were being tossed out, driven out, especially the Christians were driven out of Israel. And so he's writing to what we call the diaspora, or those who had been dispersed around. And so he's writing this letter to them. Now, James is the half-brother of Jesus. He was born to Mary and Joseph after Jesus was born. She was a virgin until after Jesus, and then she had family. Now, not every denomination agrees on that, but as we look at kind of what, rather than tradition, but look at what the Bible has to say, it looks as if this is a half-brother of Jesus. Secondly, he's the leader of the church in Jerusalem through some very difficult issues and very difficult circumstances. He actually didn't become a believer in Christ, it doesn't look like in the scriptures, until after Jesus was resurrected. Is his half-brother. I'm sure he struggled with going, I don't know, what do I do with this guy? He's my brother, but he never did anything wrong. You know, I wish I could see a movie of Jesus' life, right? I wonder, did he ever pull a prank? It doesn't tell us in the scripture, so it's good that it doesn't tell us. But I wonder, did he ever pull a prank? You know, I know he never did anything sinful, but are all pranks sinful? I think not. I think some pranks are very appropriate. You know, I think some pranks are great. And I'm sure, did Jesus have a sense of humor? The scriptures really, frankly, don't tell us. But I think, of course, he had a sense of humor. He was human, and he was God, but he was human. Did he ever pull a prank on his mother? I think so. I would like to see it on film. It's just one of my things I'd like to see. But he was the leader. James eventually became the leader of the church in Jerusalem. And he led through some incredibly difficult issues and circumstances. Third, he seems to be the social conscience, at least one of them, the social conscience of the early church. If you read about James, not only in the book of James, but other places in the scriptures, he constantly was saying, hey, don't forget the poor. Don't forget the oppressed. Don't forget the widow. Don't forget the orphan. Don't forget. He seemed to have an incredibly strong social conscience of his day, and he throws that out, and he drives it forward. It's probably one of the things that got him in trouble with the Jewish leaders of his day. But he is the social conscience of the early church in many ways. In fact, let me read this. This is one author put it this way. In the context of the violent historical circumstances of his day, James, the brother of Jesus, wrote this epistle sometime before 62 AD, the year that he was killed. We'll talk about that in a minute. The 50s, not the 1950s, but the 50s, the real 50s. The 50s saw the growth of turmoil and violence in the Roman region called Judea, as the Jews became more and more frustrated with the occupation, injustice, and poverty caused by the occupying Roman army. It continued into the 60s, in the years just before James was killed. War broke out with Rome that would lead to the destruction of Jerusalem and the scattering of the people, accentuated eventually by the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. So you just got to know, the following years after Jesus' resurrection, the next 40 years were incredibly tumultuous. And eventually there was full-out war, and they destroyed the city of Jerusalem and took the temple and knocked it to the ground. It's an incredible time. Now, let's just go on. This epistle is renowned for exhortations on fighting poverty and caring for the poor in practical ways, in standing up for the oppressed, in not being like the world in the way one responds to the evil being demonstrated around him. These are probably great qualities for today's church. This would be important for us today. Worldly wisdom is rejected, and people are exhorted to embrace heavenly wisdom, which includes peacemaking without passively ignoring the need for righteousness and justice. It goes on, this author, and says, this approach sees the epistle as a real letter with a real immediate purpose to encourage Christian Jews not to revert to violence in their response to injustice and poverty, but to stay focused on doing good, on staying committed to a holy lifestyle, and to embrace the wisdom of heaven rather than that of the world. This is a powerful person. This is a really important person. This letter is incredibly important. And he has something to say to us about the church. Now, just so you know, not only was he the social conscience of the disciples, but his death by stoning came at the hands of Ananias ben Ananias, the chief priest, in 62 AD. And history tells us that what they did is they took him onto the pinnacle of the temple where Jesus was tempted by Satan, and it put him onto the pinnacle, and they threw him off. And that at his landing, he did not die. And so they stoned him, and one man took a club and beat him until he was dead. That's how he died. And he knew, like many, that he would die for his faith. So, what he has to write maybe makes a difference. So let's just start there real quickly. He says in James 2, my brothers. He's talking to the believers in the church, my brothers. It's an incredible comment about family, right? Brothers and sisters, that's who we are in the family of Christ. In the family of God, we are family. We're brothers and sisters. And he says, hey, dear brothers, and now let's highlight it. Show no partiality. Show no partiality. Let's just stop there for a second. There's a couple of different definitions of partiality, if you look it up in Webster's. One is this. Let's put it bigger there. One is a particular liking or fondness for something. A particular likeness. Now, we all have that, right? For example, let me see if I can just throw it out here a little bit. There's all sorts of different kinds of food, right? There's a lot of different kinds of food. But for this morning, we're going to limit it to 2, and I'm going to have you vote, okay? How many people are going to say Mexican or Chinese? How many people go Mexican? Okay, how many people go Chinese? All right, here's the deal. Okay, we've got a division in the church. So, if anybody is here this morning that said Mexican that I don't know very well or hardly know at all, would you risk coming up here? You go, man, I don't even know that dude. But just come up, I promise you it'll be worth it, okay? Someone that maybe doesn't know me very well that was on the Mexican side and someone on the Chinese side. Come on, I need somebody or else it's going to ruin this thing, okay? So, okay, if I know you just a little bit, would you come up? Okay. I don't know. Which one are you?
Chinese.
You're Chinese. So if you come over here, young man. Okay, Chinese. Hey, how about a Mexican? Not a Mexican, Mexican food. You can be Mexican. I don't care. Okay? How about a Mexican? I need a Mexican food person. Someone who wants to eat Mexican. Okay, Lynn, let's go. Yeah, today. Okay, so we've got, Chinese and Mexican. Okay, so let's start with Mexican over here. Burritos or tacos?
Tacos.
Oh, tacos all the way. Okay, orange chicken or beef and broccoli?
Orange chicken.
Orange chicken, okay. What about queso versus salsa?
Salsa.
Salsa, okay. And how about fried rice versus white rice?
Fried rice.
Oh, yeah, okay. You guys with them yet? You guys going to go to dinner together? Okay, let's go over here. Beans or rice?
Rice.
Yeah, I like beans. Okay. And over here, egg roll versus crab rangoon.
Crab rangoon.
Okay, you guys. And let's finish up with this. This is really the one. I love this one. Flan versus a churro.
Oh, churro.
How many people would have said flan? Okay, you guys need to meet and talk because that's a very inappropriate food. And let's go over here. Fortune cookie or an almond cookie?
Fortune cookie.
Oh, fortune cookie. Okay, I like that. Okay, so here's the deal. Here's a gift certificate to a Mexican restaurant, and here's one to a Chinese restaurant. You guys should have come up. All right, you guys. All right, so that's one definition of partiality, but that's not the one we're talking about. Because there's something far more profound than this. Here's the other definition of partiality. It is an unfair bias in favor of one thing or person compared to another. It's favoritism. And here we find, James says, show no unfair bias towards anybody. It's not appropriate, right? That's what he's saying. In fact, the Greek word for this partiality means this. It means receiving the face. It's this. It's the evaluation simply on the externals rather than seeing the intrinsic value of each person's humanity. It's taking only the externals, and all of a sudden we begin to have favoritism. And he says there's no place for that in the church. None. The externals mean relatively little compared to what's inside, right? In fact, he says they mean nothing compared to the inside. Show no partiality. And then look at this in verse 1. Let's kind of grab it. Let's box it in blue. My brothers, show no partiality as you hold the faith in our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory. As you hold the faith, he says there's no place for partiality here. And this is not just, this is the Lord of glory. The Lord of all heaven and earth. There's no place for partiality. Right? None. Let's just read. He's going to illustrate it here, okay? And we'll illustrate it later. But look at this. Verse 2. Box it. For if a man wearing a gold ring and fine clothes comes into your assembly, and a poor man in shabby clothing also comes in. Now, is he using this just as an illustration? Yes, in part. Was it something that was beginning to happen in the church? Probably. Because the early church was primarily poor people. The Christian church does not start among the elite. It started among the poor. But eventually there were people who were wealthy who came to faith. And they began to enter into the church. And the temptation was to treat them different, to treat them better. Look at this. In fact, he says, if a man wearing a gold ring and fine clothes comes into your assembly, and a poor man in shabby clothes also comes in, if you pay attention to the one who wears the fine clothing, and you say, hey, why don't you sit over here in the good place? Why don't you get in the front row where everybody's going to see you? Why don't you sit there? While you say to the poor man, hey, yeah, why don't you stand over there? Or why don't you come and just sit down here at my feet where people won't see? That can happen. Look at this in verse 4. Have you not then made distinctions among yourselves? And this is really strong language. Look at this. Have you not made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Rhetorical question. But the answer, if that happens, is yes. That's what you've done. You know, you think about favoritism, you think maybe it's not that bad. But here he says, if you do that, you have made distinctions and you've become judges with evil thoughts. That's a pretty heavy thing to say. Wow. Well, then look at this in verse 5. Listen, my beloved brothers, has not God chosen those who are poor in the world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom, which he has promised to those who love him? Sometimes it says it's more difficult for a rich man to get into heaven than to go through the eye of a needle. Sometimes the wealth of this world distracts us from that which is really important. And he says there is something incredible about being poor that drives you to say, I need God. And sometimes when we have a lot of things, we have very little need for God. Until life goes south. And then you go, oh my gosh. Verse 6, but if you have dishonored the poor man, but you, he says, have dishonored the poor man. Wow. Are not the rich the ones who oppress you and the ones who drag you into court? It's kind of still true, isn't it? Sometimes it's the rich who have that ability. And he's finding this. That's not what's going on in his day. Verse 7, are they not the ones who blaspheme the honorable name by which you were called? In his day, it was the rich who dishonored Christ. He says, why are you treating them differently? Better. It's crazy. Show no favoritism. So look at this in verse 8. If you really fulfill, let's box it, the royal law, the real law, the most important law, the highest law, if you really fulfill the royal law according to the scripture, let's box this. Here's the royal law. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. If you do that, you're doing well. Man, that's what it's all about. You're doing well. If you've loved your neighbor as yourself. Wow. Verse 9. But, circle it. But, if you show partiality, you are committing sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. Then look at verse 10. For whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point has been guilty of it all. Okay, we're going to stop right there. So he's saying, show no partiality. And if you do, you are committing sin. And if you think you've got it together, you're doing really well, and you're mostly obeying all the law, but in this thing of where you're playing favorites or playing partiality, anybody who has violated one piece of the law has violated the whole law. There is no place for favoritism and partiality in the kingdom of God. None. Not at all. Not one piece. And this pushes up against so many things in our culture, in our world. So let me just kind of jump to the end here. Let's apply it, okay? So, therefore, what do we do now with this? So let me just ask one basic question for all of us. Here's the first one. How or where is the 21st century church guilty of showing partiality and therefore violating the royal law of Christ to love our neighbors as ourselves? Where is the church in the 21st century guilty, violating this principle? Now, the 21st century is, it's a big place, a big world, right? And there's a Christian church all over the world. And it probably has some practicals that look different from place to place. So why don't we see if we can bring it home a little bit. How or where is Quest guilty of showing partiality and therefore violating the royal law? Where do we as a church do this? Probably need to think about it and talk about it. Let's be honest. But let's ask it a little bit more closer to home. How or where are you guilty of showing partiality? You might want to think about it and wrestle with it. Where are you showing partiality? Because there's no place in the kingdom for it. There's no place for it. Maybe let's bring it a little bit closer to home. Where am I showing partiality? I have to ask myself that same question. It's not just you, right? It's all of us. So why don't we just back off a little bit here and ask this. How or where are we guilty of showing partiality and violating the royal law of Christ of not loving our neighbors as ourselves? So I began to ask the question, where could we show partiality? Can I just go through a list and maybe challenge us to think about? First of all, it could be in the area of age. We live in a time where ageism really does happen. Sometimes your age matters to people, or your age doesn't matter. They don't care. If you're older, you're probably not worth talking to. If you're younger, you really don't count until you get to a certain age. You're not important until you reach a certain place, age-wise, right? That's ageism. What about that? What about gender? There's two. We have two, and there's often conflict. But what about the value of each gender? Male and female. Sometimes do we play favorites, look down on, demean, dismiss the other gender? We live in a nation that struggles with it. It's behind some of the stuff that's happening in all the chaos of our political world. Well, what about ethnicity? Do we do that? Probably. We play favorites ethnically. What about this marital status? Do you really matter until you're married? You're not really a full adult till you're married. Right? So sometimes the church communicates. Oh, you're single. Oh. You don't really totally matter yet. The scriptures would fight that every inch of the way, right? Paul would say, what an incredible gift to be single. What an incredibly beautiful thing. Value it. Church, value it. What about this social hierarchy? Those who are socially elite versus those who are not. Sometimes that's favoritism. What about ability? And what about disability? Sometimes we shy away or don't value people with certain abilities or certain disabilities. Or what about economic prowess? The ability to influence with money. Sometimes do we play favorites? That's one of the reasons that in Quest, at least, we've made a policy that any leadership will never know the giving habits of anybody in our church, ever, because of the perceived and possible favoritism that we might express towards people who give more versus give less. There's only one person in our church who ever knows those lists, and they're people that we trust highly, and they're very confidential. I don't want to ever know, ever, because I don't want you to think I might treat you differently, and I don't want to risk treating you differently. What about this one? church position or responsibility? Do we treat them differently if they're in church leadership? Do they get favored? It's really easy to do, right? So it seems to me what we have to do is we have to dig through all those externals and find the core humanity of a person, right? Can I just maybe for a second give an example? Gina, would you come over here for a second? I haven't warned any of these people, so just know I am about to maybe do some really stupid things. Okay, I'd like to dig through a little bit and find the core of this person. So here's a human being made in the image of God. Let's push aside all the other externals. Let's just say, wow, this is a person who is created in the image of God. Period. Then, if we work our way back out, there are some unique things that describe her, but they don't define her only, but that describe her. She's a woman, made in the image of God. She is of Indian descent, made in the image of God, born in the United States, but Indian. Her husband, born in India. In this very unique cultural dynamics. Economically, I don't really know exactly, but probably she's not living in Palos Verdes, so I'm going to say in California. She's not super rich, but she's not super poor. It feels poor sometimes, doesn't it? Just whatever. But this is a human being. Thank you. This is really an important lady. She's a person. What about someone who's single here? I won't even pick you out. Say, you know what? You're a human being, right? What if you're divorced? Does that define you as a person? No. It describes a certain situation in your life, but it's a human being. And we need to take all the externals away. Oh, you're white? Oh, guess what? Unique. Oh, you're black? Cool. Oh, you're a woman? By God's creation, you're a woman. And we ought to celebrate it. But at the core, you're a human being. No place for partiality in the gospel, right? There's none. Oh, you're older? Well, guess what? We're all getting there. So let's not be too flippy-dippy about that, right? Oh, you're younger? Guess what? It's cool to be young. We were all young once, though you don't believe it. We were all there one time. And there's a value to it, a beautifulness to it. There is no place for partiality in the kingdom, in the gospel of Christ. And yet it happens. It's really easy to have it happen. Could I, for a moment, risk Ray and Pat have a son named Scott, and Scott has cerebral palsy. And could I just say, we need to dig through and find the humanity of Scott. And in God's unique and somewhat confusing providence and sovereignty, he has cerebral palsy. But guess what? He's a human being. There is no value below anyone else in any way, shape, or form. He is a person of incredible joy. He is amazing. And if you want to have a good time, come hang out with Scott. Because he's a human being, has value. There's no place for partiality or favoritism in the kingdom of Christ. No place for it. I wonder, I started this whole week thinking, oh, this isn't really apropos for Quest. And I came to the end of the week thinking, oh my goodness, there is such a place for this in Quest. We need to embrace this, because when we do not embrace it, when we do not treat people with value, But when we treat people with favoritism or partiality, we have violated the very core of the gospel, to love your neighbor as yourself. We have ruined it at its core. When we condemn people for who they are, who God created them to be, we have violated God himself. And I think that's a mess. So here's at the end of the day. Favoritism, partiality, an unfair bias that favors one person over another violates the most essential core value of a gospel-centered church at its very core. So today, as you watch people, it'd be a little awkward, but I want you to just, when you see every person, just dig through all the externals. You might not want to do this, but just dig through all the externals and find their core humanity. And then work your way back out and go, wow, look at that. Someone made in the image of God that has incredible value. And wow, look what God made him. A man, that's cool. And a woman, that's incredible. Look at that older person. Man, just think how much they've learned and know. Oh, look at that younger person. Look at that incredible energy. And we'd walk right through all those values. Oh, look, God bless them financially. God bless them. Use it for the gospel. God made me a little bit poorer. God bless me. Let's use it for the gospel. Whatever it might be, that we would simply value the human being and dig through all those externals that our world is all about, right? It's all about the externals and very little about the internals. But what about this human being that we need to value? There's no place for partiality. No place for favoritism. None in the gospel, in the church. That, I think, will give us enough to do this coming week. That wherever you go, work, home, ball game, wherever it might be, dig through all those stupid externals and find the core humanity of this person. Because we're all equal at the end of the day, right? You guys, at the end of life, there's really only one set of clothes you're leaving with, and it's staying here and you're going. Right? You're not taking anything with you. There's no room. You're just going like you came. All the rest is peripherals. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to take a minute and say, okay, Lord, where are the places where I'm tempted to be partial, play favorites? That I need to confess as sin. I need to lay it before you and call it nothing less than that. And I need you to change my heart. I need you to change my heart. What are those places? Maybe there's just 2 or 3 you could check off. Let's go back to that list, if we can't, and just right before. Just pick a couple. Pick your tops, a couple of top ones, and ask God to do some work in your life. Okay? Let's take a minute and just let you think about that and pray about that. The band will come up. We'll end our time by worshiping together.